the resistance to the idea of adaptation was the people who were most concerned to advocate and implement mitigation, by which they meant the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, were concerned that if we began to talk about adaptation, that would mean that they were failing, or they were afraid of failing with their mitigation agenda. So if you said we can adapt, then their view was, no, you won't need to adapt because we can do the mitigation. And so what I was arguing and advocating and finding evidence for was to show that you would need both mitigation and adaptation, and you wouldn't be able to reduce climate change fast enough to avoid all need for adaptation. Social conditions and culture, yes. I think I would add on economic conditions, because when you look at what happens in an extreme climatic weather event that is associated with a disaster, and you look post-disaster to see what happened, you see, generally speaking, that it's the most vulnerable people. That tends to mean the poorest people with less capacity to do anything about it for themselves. And also the people who are most exposed, who are in the path of harm's way. So I think a lot of decisions that are made, policy decisions and in the private sector for development, growth, economic activities, incidentally put people into harm's way. They live on steep slopes, they live in floodplains, they live on exposed coastal areas, they live in semi-arid and agricultural areas where loss of rainfall is a very serious problem. So yes, those general conditions of society, conditions of exposure and vulnerability, and the way in which generally I would say the world is now going about the development process. Well, who depends on the scale you're looking at. If you're looking at the global international scale, then it's the poorer countries, the least developed countries, and those in most exposed locations, such as small island states subject to sea level rise. If you look internally within a country, then, as I say, it's the people who are in harm's way, who are where the climate variability and extreme events are most likely to hit, and people who have the least capacity to do anything for themselves, to build stronger housing, to build housing in higher places, to build better infrastructure, and to move out or evacuate short-term or long-term when some extremes occur. And we've done this by, many people have, by post-disaster investigation. So when something happens and these losses occur, then you go in and say, well, who suffered, who needs help? The humanitarian community comes into play and starts to provide assistance to those most in need, who are those who've suffered most and are most vulnerable. I can hardly underestimate the importance and the urgency of this. I think this was on its way to being the top environmental, if not the top global problem concerning the future welfare of humanity before we were struck by the COVID pandemic. And post-pandemic, I think this will then very much re-emerge. It is urgent. The latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report said we have 10 years in which to control emissions sufficiently to prevent irreversible changes, which will not be able to, once they've occurred and once they're underway, we will not be able to reverse, which poses nothing less than a serious existential threat, if not to the whole of humanity, then certainly to organized, advanced society as we now as we now understand it. So it's a very serious threat. Am I hopeful? Cautiously, yes. I think the youth movement is strong, school strikes, that sort of thing. I think there's a growing population awareness as people suffer themselves or they hear about others suffering from wildfires and extreme storms and droughts in other parts of the world. But also because I think the private sector, which has long avoided expressing concern about climate change, is now coming around to the view. And I speak of the private sector in particular, of the fossil fuel industry, the oil and coal industry, where the large corporations and the investors are now beginning to see that they have to move out of the fossil fuel industry and start to invest more in renewable energy. Whether they will do that enough or fast enough, and whether the nations can cooperate on that sufficiently, is something that is a matter of considerable uncertainty. But I think there is a move in that direction.